Good morning. Welcome to the panel on the presidential executive session on Dissent in the Post-Truth Era, Latinx Communities Organize and Resist. We are going to move through and have people present in the order on the program, and I will make the first presentation. Donald Trump was elected on a platform of demonizing immigrants, American isolationism, and increased military aggression abroad, the reduction of civil liberties in the name of patriotism, and the advancement of racist, xenophobic, and nativist policies that both exclude and criminalize refugee communities. In the first 60 days alone, the administration passed 38 policy changes that included assaults on women's reproductive rights, a ban on Muslim settlement, and so much more. His repeated lying has led to energy spent on contesting quote-unquote alternative facts, as well as contending with new political communities and increased hate crimes. Genevieve Negron-Gonzalez suggests, quote, "This moment is both new and distinct, yet also bears a striking resemblance to some of the darkest moments in the annals of American history." However, Jonathan Rosa and Yarimar Bonilla caution the characterization of Trump's election as exceptional effectively delinks present-day racism from colonial histories of power, disavows settler colonialism, and silences critiques of global coloniality. The response to Trump Trump's discourse began before the inauguration. Social activists around the world mobilized anti-Trump protests. The Women's March on the day after his inauguration has been heralded as the largest single-day synchronized global mass mobilization ever, where over 5 million people demonstrated in the streets in more than 673 marches around the globe. The Women's March in Washington, D.C. had over 700 partner organizations, and organizers were proud to have mobilized hundreds of thousands of first-time activists. The discourse related to resist, or the resistance, now circulates broadly, including a call for a general strike. More than 6,000 organizations registered with Indivisible, the organization that grew out of the post-election guide to congressional advocacy. Political pundits have remarked on the novelty of activism in the post-truth era, noting that participants were diverse by race and include those from the middle class, the chess moms and scientists who describe their activism as new. However, I agree with historian Beverly Gage, who asserts that a call to resistance is different than a call to organize, which conjures visions of better worlds. I follow Rosa and Bonilla's lead and address their query: what populations and communities have long been imagining and enacting alternatives, and how might we take our cue from them? This paper discusses the organizing strategies and discourses promoted by women of color activists in the movement for reproductive justice in the current era, and reflects upon the implications for the quote-unquote new politics of resistance. From their perspective, both business as usual and an increasingly hostile climate is occurring, which makes their work more complex and draining. I will focus here briefly on two issues of importance to those working in the movement for reproductive justice: the efforts to impede women's right to reproductive health care and immigration. The movement for reproductive justice prides itself on using the frameworks of intersectionality and human rights to advocate for women's rights to have children, to terminate their pregnancies, and to raise their children in safe and healthy environments. Led by and working on behalf of women of color, the movement has done impressive work in contesting the pejorative representations of women of color, engaging in grassroots organizing, and pushing policies that address social inequalities related to the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, age, ability, and legal status. Activists in the movement for reproductive justice have a long history, going back to the 1990s, for organizing efforts that highlighted the racially specific histories of different social categories, namely African Americans, Arabs and Muslims, Asian and Pacific Islanders, Chicanas, Latinas, and Native Americans. Simultaneously, they have been working in solidarity by consciously using the term women of color and forging coalitions in relation to specific issues. These organizations emphasize structural inequalities and organize their bases and engage in policy work. They also engage in what they call culture shift work that includes using storytelling, artwork, and online blogs where anyone can post an image or comments to emphasize the strength and resiliency of communities of color, the importance of balancing mind, body, spirit, and expressing women's full selves. Scholarship on women of color activism shows an intersectionality approach requires flexibility, and the participants must negotiate dynamics of difference and sameness in relation to axes of power in local movement contexts. They have forged differential consciousness or coalitional consciousness, practices oriented towards building and sustaining coalitions and creating narratives of identity and inclusion. The Trump election pushed organizations to add nuance to their normal practice. I have conducted ethnographic research, including participant observation, interviews, and focus groups for the past 5 years with organizations involved in the movement for reproductive justice. Initially, many organizers, like most of us, experienced a range of emotions about the Trump election: shock, anger, fear, despair, and a desire to connect with fellow activists. One Latina in the movement for reproductive justice with a BA and known as a fierce public speaker suddenly was now intimidated because she had a Spanish accent and worried that would elicit threatening comments from the public. Another found the president's authoritarianism traumatizing since it reminded her of a coup that took place in her country of origin. One advocate affirmed racial tension has been so high since Trump came into office. Organizations have had to take time for reflection and finding resources such as counselors to come in to help staff cope with the new normal. Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights, for example, took time for some collective meditation, sharing their feelings, and brainstorming about next steps. These organizations also found increased resistance by white allies to support their policy advocacy and racial equality issues. Secondly, several reproductive justice organizations began work that helped vulnerable subjects understand the policy changes. So Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective organized a webinar on immigration, refugees, and reproductive justice that had speakers talk about their ongoing work on immigrant rights, including working with youth and workers, and they had lawyers and activists from ally organizations explain Trump's February 23rd executive order on immigration and how to organize their constituencies. And the Movement for Reproductive Justice literally held a webinar the day after the inauguration, so I felt like it was such a breath of fresh air to feel like people are already contesting the new presidency. A few reproductive justice organizations performed a radical pivot that included cutting programming and staff and redesigning their work. For example, Coraline's director, Sujatha Judison, said, 3 weeks after the election, I started asking some hard questions about Coraline's work. What did we need to do differently to respond strategically and thoughtfully to this new reality? How could we do our best and bravest work in this moment? Judison explained Coraline's new focus. Over the next 8 weeks, this re-examination of our work in a new political context resulted in cutting 2/3 of our programming, radically redesigning the rest, and trimming our staff by 1/3, which meant laying off 4 people, so that we could effectively meet this current moment. Coraline then focused solely on training 300 to 500 leaders a year in innovation and speaking race to power, and brought in all staff, including their clerical staff, to think strategically about best practices for accomplishing this goal. Most organizations, however, intensified their work, especially with immigrant rights and women's access to reproductive health rights. All of them had their staff attend demonstrations, including Twitter chats, in support of retaining the Affordable Care Act and protesting the global gag rule and protesting that employers are allowed to drop contraceptive coverage on moral grounds. Others made immigration a renewed focus. Color, again, for example, shifted from hosting cafecitos, where immigrants could come and learn about reproductive justice in informal settings in the Spanish language, to hosting Know Your Rights workshops that brought in lawyers to explain how the undocumented could navigate the new anti-immigrant climate. Once the Republicans began their failed attempt at repealing the Affordable Care Act, Color started educating immigrants about the implications. They were mindful, and some of their staff is undocumented, I should say, they were mindful the undocumented have no rights to health insurance under the ACA, but citizen children do, which is critical for the over 4 million children living in mixed status families in the United States. The first year of Trump's administration, mental health issues have increased dramatically and gained texture, as Ana Suceth Valladares of California Latinas for Reproductive Justice explained. The mental health was really around the stress and anxiety of everyone in the community, like little children, preschoolers, the moms. We spent a long time processing and talking about how we needed to support young people because they were in tears and were afraid, maybe because they were undocumented, but their family members, they were documented, but their family members weren't. And how a lot of times when we think about mental health, we don't think about middle schoolers, high schoolers, who have to carry the burden of their family. So it was a really interesting conversation about that. After multiple iterations of primary research that included a community needs assessment and focus groups, CLRJ's staff periodically brainstorm about how to utilize their own findings, how their research resonates with other scholarship, and what the policy issues are for their partner organizations so as to strategize how to move forward. Organizations also began being careful about where they hold their events and how they advertise them, mindful that Immigration and Customs Enforcement has increased arrests by more than 40% this year. ICE is now targeting sanctuary cities and stalking immigrants at courthouses, hospitals, and schools, and deporting those with DACA who are authorized to remain in the country. Cristina Aguilar, Executive Director of Color, pointed out, when we had Latino Advocacy Day this year, we were worried there could be ICE raids. So we had to think that through and plan the same for our Know Your Rights workshops. The reality of the fear has been the hardest. Finally, reproductive justice organizations find themselves doubling down on their coalition work. In some instances, that means confronting allies who are hesitant to take political stances. Cristina Aguilar recalls, we started to call for more authentic intersectionality within our coalition space and really putting our challenge out to our partners. Color is going to be more focused on immigrant rights and justice work. Remember, we've always focused on this, but it's going to elevate, and we hope you'll join us. Stand with us at press conferences and send out calls to action to your lists. We're really trying to make the case and to do calls to action. We're working hard to try to dismantle white supremacy as it exists in our own progressive spaces, and then moving beyond that and doing it in a way that was about calling on consensual allyship and calling on restorative justice practices. So one of the things I'm hearing sort of behind the scenes is not only are they having to confront their so-called progressive allies, but also really making the case that intersectionality means you don't just focus on one sector of your constituency. You're always paying attention to all vulnerable sectors. In other instances, mainstream organizations such as NARAL, Pro-Choice America, and Planned Parenthood, and funders of nonprofits have stepped up. Several reproductive justice organizations had funders reach out to them precisely because they have histories of working with immigrants, poor women, and youth of color. As former Ford Foundation program officer Rocio Cordova said, we've been trying to support work that is proactive, and organizations that have a proactive vision and have developed a strong strategy and infrastructure that can both do the proactive work and be responsive to the reactive work, and that's really important to keep our movement going in the long term, because it can't be all reaction all the time. The political challenges have been there for 40 years. It's nothing new. I started this work in the early 1990s, and there were all kinds of challenges then, too. In conclusion, the organizations working on reproductive justice are part of broad social movements intent on challenging conservative policies and cultural politics. Reproductive justice activists provide a model for multi-scalar politics that are fluid in relation to shifting conservative agendas and the denigration of specific racial categories. They remind us that it is reasonable to fight for the impossible. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Andrea Bolivar, who will be speaking on transgender Latina sex workers, persistence and resistance in the era of 45.
It was my first time meeting up with Yesenia after my full-time fieldwork in Chicago from June 2015 to August 2016. And it was my first time seeing her in person since the inauguration. Yesenia is a 36-year-old Puerto Rican sex-working transgender woman. During my fieldwork, I saw her a few times a week every week. I would buy her coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, and sometimes she would buy me a piragua from a street vendor, and we'd walk up and down Paseo Boricua, where she lived and worked, and also where she volunteered in an addiction treatment program. She struggled with drugs in her early 20s, but had been sober for over 10 years. She was in good health and volunteered at the program as a way to give thanks for her life and comfort others suffering through the throes of addiction. However, like many other interlocutors, Yesenia would proudly explain to me that transgender Latina women do not work the streets to feed drug habits, like cisgender sex workers, supposedly, but because they cannot get hired in the formal sector. While this distinction may not always hold true, it articulates the fact that systemic transphobia in the legal employment sector is one of the main reasons trans Latinas turn to sex work. Notably, systemic transphobia is also intersected by the wider politics of racism, colorism, anti-immigration policing, especially for those who are undocumented and for Afro-Latina women. Having to negotiate these processes, plus the violences frequently encountered in sexual labor, makes for a life of precarity. Yet, Yesenia was one of my most reliable interlocutors. Our regular walks punctuated my fieldwork, which was otherwise nebulous and unpredictable. She was a rock for me in a lot of ways, and I missed her, so I was excited to see her again. We were supposed to meet at the Pilsen Library on the west side in Mexican Chicago, another area where Yesenia does sex work. I arrived before her, which is typical. I waited for half an hour, but wasn't concerned. Then 45 minutes, then an hour had passed, and I started to worry. I called her cell phone, and she didn't answer. I went inside the library and looked around, thinking we somehow passed each other. Something told me to check behind the library. As I walked around the side of the building, I saw a small figure farther down the street. Upper body falling over to one side, left arm outstretched, head hanging down, chest slowly inhaling and exhaling. It was Yesenia. She was asleep, standing on the sidewalk as people passed her by. My heart stopped for a second. I got closer, called out her name, and she awoke. A huge smile grew on her face, and she said, "Mamita, so happy to see you." We embraced. I asked her if she was okay, and she seemed unaware that she was just asleep. I insisted on taking her to lunch, hoping that a good meal would sober her up. We got tacos, and throughout our conversation, she drifted in and out. I fought back tears in a state of disbelief that Yesenia, one of my most reliable interlocutors, was likely back on drugs after over 10 years of being sober. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, since my own research demonstrates that life as a trans Latina sex worker is often perilous, debilitating, and short. There were so many questions I had planned on asking her, but instead managed only to get out, more so as an expression of exasperation, this Trump administration. She replied, "Oh, mamita, that's just business as usual." She was asleep again before I could ask her to elaborate. Oh no. Sorry, missing a slide. We eventually finished lunch, and I made sure she got home safely. In my work, I challenge the tendency in the literature to focus on transgender white subjects and place the trans Latina women at the nexus of critical debates about geography, race, gender, sexuality, and class. I also suggest that we take the words of sex-working trans Latina women seriously. In this paper, I ethnographically and theoretically situate trans women of color at the center of the economy, knowledge production, and the everyday, 3 arenas they are actively excluded from. Business as usual. What does Yesenia mean by business? What is usual? What can sex-working trans Latinas tell us about both in the current social and political moment in the US? I argue that their experiences reveal that while some things are novel, many are not, resulting in a profound ambivalence that also characterizes their lives more broadly. This ambivalence, however, does not result in stagnancy, and instead can be a space of potentiality. I then turn to their activist efforts, which arise from an ambiguous space of potentiality, and contend that we should also focalize them, as trans Latinas have persisted and resisted despite decades, even centuries, of grave violence and insecurity. As this panel reminds us, anti-Latinx sentiments and policies are increasing at alarming rates under the current political administration. One such example can be found in the intensification of the deportation industrial complex. Attacks against the transgender community have also escalated. For instance, federal protections for transgender students, which simply allowed them to use the bathroom, were rescinded. All mention of the LGBTQ community was removed from the White House and the State Department websites. Attempts were recently made to bar transgender people from joining the military, and the Attorney General has explicitly stated that workplace discrimination protections do not apply to transgender people. Surely then, life must be markedly worse for transgender Latinas. An ethnographic perspective, however, reveals a number of messy contradictions which beg more careful analysis. Before the ascent of 45, the women with whom I work were recurrently policed when in various public spaces, including bathrooms, because of their gender and race. And the majority were pushed out of school because of harassment by peers and even teachers. They were likely not the LGBTQ individuals being referred to on the White House website. In fact, they repeatedly lamented that they are triply excluded from the dominant LGBTQ movement because of their race, transgender, and occupation. The US military has long been a tool of racial and sexual terror against people of color, and Latin Americans especially, with particularly violent interventions in Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, all places my interlocutors are from or have familial connections. Moreover, trans Latinas were never protected by anti-discrimination laws. They reported countless examples of employment discrimination at various points of the job-seeking process and when actively working in the formal sector because of their gender, their race, especially those who are Black and/or primarily Spanish-speaking. Lastly, undocumented trans folks have lived in fear of deportation since long before 45. Sex working, I found, increases one's chance of encountering the deportation machine, and vice versa. Being deported increases one's likelihood of engaging in sexual labor. Yesenia's sage statement, then, that the activities of this new presidential administration are just business as usual, reflects the claim recently made by Jonathan Rosa and Yarimar Bonilla, the contemporary era is not exceptional. This country was not intended for trans women of color, and in fact, it was built to work against them. To be sure, I do not mean to underestimate the gravity of the current political period. In fact, on the night of the election, Trans Lifeline, this is a crisis hotline for transgender individuals, received twice as many calls in that one night than it does in one typical day. And at least 8 people committed suicide, most of them teenagers. My undocumented interlocutors, for example, have expressed that they are more scared than before, but that living in fear is certainly not new. They are used to regularly encountering violence from clients, police officers, immigration officers, prison guards, romantic partners, employers, potential employers, other members of the LGBTQ community, other sex workers, and random people just passing them by on the streets. Therefore, theorizing from the experiences of transgender Latinas reveals that the present moment is one of deep ambivalence. Ambivalence, however, does not equate to complacency. Instead, ambivalence can be a space of potentiality. And business as usual can also refer to the ways in which trans Latinas have been and are persisting and resisting despite their multiple marginalizations. My interlocutors have been involved in activist efforts for years, and trans women of color have been at the forefront, whether they're recognized for it or not, of many pivotal moments in LGBTQ history. For 8 years, the Trans Latina Coalition, for example, has spearheaded and participated in actions that seek to both reform the political enterprise from within, like fighting for legal protection, and more radically challenge the system as a whole, like stopping traffic covered in red paint to draw attention to the exorbitantly high rates of murder of trans women of color. To be clear, however, many interlocutors have expressed that the new presidential administration has encouraged them to fight harder. I recently spoke with Yesenia on the phone. She was lucid and she said, quote, "We must make our presence known. People must know that we exist. Our existence is resistance," end quote. Yet the politics of visibility are also fraught amongst queer people of color. At other times, Yesenia and others have suspected that more visibility does not necessarily mean less violence, and in fact can mean the opposite. Regardless, while acknowledging the risk of visibility and the ways the current moment is not completely novel, they can also be galvanized by it. Brenda, who is 46, Mexican, and was undocumented for 12 years before she was granted asylum, which is very rare, by the way, to get asylum, said the following a few weeks ago when reflecting on the presidential administration, quote, "He's the enemy. Consequently, he's been creating hate. He's given people the tools and the right to hate the trans-Latina community. We already had so many communities against us. On the other hand," she says, "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I think we are in a trans revolution all over the country. Trans women of color are standing up. We are fighting against Trump. I see it all over. The community is creating and building spaces, even underground. We are standing up for justice," end quote. Brenda then excitedly reminded me of the first trans gay migrant caravan, or Rainbow 17, which consisted of 11 trans women and 6 gay men from different Central American countries who crossed the border and surrendered themselves to border officials. After holding up a colorful sign that read Primera Caravan Trans Gay 2017. Before crossing at Nogales, Arizona, they all met each other after being denied asylum in Mexico. They bonded over similar experiences of gendered violence in Central America. Then they brainstormed and reached out to numerous legal organizations specializing in asylum in the US. Attorneys and other volunteers flew to Mexico and provided legal service, and some even crossed with them. Protesters showed support on both sides of the border. After they turned themselves in, the Rainbow 17 were detained in New Mexico. Brenda, who crossed 12 years ago, was deported 3 times and has been detained for many months in her life, could relate to the members of the caravan, especially the trans women. She felt so compelled to help them. She said she knew that they were getting legal counsel, but she, quote, "knew from experience," end quote. She had lived it, she asserted. Brenda is one of the most tenacious people I had ever met, and she contacted one of the legal organizations traveling to New Mexico and asked if she could come along. They said yes. They flew her to New Mexico, and she met many of the trans women. She proudly recounted to me that she coached them on what to say to asylum officers. When Brenda asked them why they sought asylum, many told her because of gang violence. She told them, "No, don't mention gangs. You must always emphasize the discrimination and violence you experience because of your gender. Always focus on your gender," she said. I was reminded of something Yesenia said to me when I began conducting research in 2015. Quote, "Activism isn't just being loud on the streets, but also the small, quiet moments of caring for a sister," end quote. Yesenia's insistence on helping the Rainbow 17 seemed to fall somewhere between these 2 modalities of activism. The sharing of knowledge, the involvement in various types of activism and care among trans Latinas can also be considered business as usual. After 2 months in detention, the labors of activists and lawyers were fruitful. 14 members of the caravan, including all the transgender women, were granted parole. They will no longer have to endure the horrific violences of being in a man's detention center while pursuing their asylum cases. While this is a victory in itself, the battle is far from over. Historically, less than 1/3 of cases are granted asylum, and 45 wants the Homeland Department Security to approve even less. Asylum seekers must wait months or years for permission to work and for access to housing or food support. This is precisely why many undocumented trans Latinas turn to sex work in the first place. Notably, sex is a crime of moral turpitude per the legal requirements of asylum, so doing sex work can make someone ineligible for asylum. Brenda and I sat in silence with this harsh reality for a few moments. I eventually mustered up enough courage to ask her how Yesenia was doing. She too suspects Yesenia is using heroin. I find myself haunted by the image of her on the sidewalk, slouched over, asleep while standing with an outstretched arm. I am simultaneously heartened that Brenda, a poor sex worker in Chicago, found a way to support her sisters over 1,000 miles away. In addition to this one act, Brenda is involved in several other activist activities and has been finding as many fora as possible to share her story and her knowledge from experience. Therefore, it is within this tension, this ambiguous space of potentiality, that my interlocutors, like many other Latinxes and transgender folks before them, develop and share unique knowledges and exercise various forms of activism, from being loud on the streets to caring for a sister in those small, quiet moments. Against the backdrop of extreme violence and political, economic, racial, and social marginalization, this too is business as usual in America. Thank you.
Here is Leo Chavez, and the title of his talk is Stigmatizing Speech and Images and Their Impact on the understandings of self and well-being among Mexican origin youth.
Well, thank you. It's a real privilege to be here, and I really appreciate it. And it's here. And the panel, of course, is great, and I really enjoyed everything I've heard so far. I'm talking about an interesting set of issues here. In 1917, you have the review of a book published by Madison Grant, and everybody we know, Franz Boas, decided to engage with this book. In Madison Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, is one of the spectacular examples of scientific racism, about how the white race was being, in a sense, diluted by incoming immigrants. And Boas decided to step up and deal with this issue publicly and wrote this report. And he quotes Grant's book. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but he said, Grant basically in his book said, "We Americans must realize that the altruistic ideals which have controlled our social development during the past century and the maudlin sentimentalism that has made America an asylum for the oppressed are sweeping the nation toward a racial abyss." He also, Grant, not Boas, also said, Grant said, the prime interest of the author, well, Boas critiques Grant and says the prime interest of the author was to support his theory, or I think we might justly say his prejudice, rather than teach unbiased conclusions based upon observed facts. He also said that the book's object is to show that democratic institutions and the arrival of immigrants of non-Western European type are a danger to the welfare of the American people. So Grant's book was definitely about America, the loss of America was great at an earlier time, if we want to put it in that kind of language. Boas lost his fight to a certain extent because in 1922 and 1924 we passed national origin quotas, severely limiting immigrants from Southern and Eastern European countries. We had already restricted Chinese and Japanese. 100 years later, no surprise, I published a book called Anchor Babies and the Challenge of Birthright Citizenship. Besides being a shameless plug for my book, it also reflects trends that I think Madison Grant would really recognize in American society and culture about immigrants and actually welcome. Because what we're seeing 100 years later after Grant is the renewal of the same ideas that Grant basically proposed in his book. It's a new nativism, and Grant would relish everything that we're basically heard today and we're experiencing. And it's basically what we're seeing with, we already heard that people say, well, this isn't new. Trump's not new. It's not. In my book on covering immigration, I kind of show that we've changed over the last 50, 60 years from a discourse that was much more balanced between affirmative and alarmist discourse, like this was pretty much an affirmative image, to much more alarmist discourse. Since 2000, when my book appeared, basically, this trend of increasingly negative or alarmist discourse has continued. And what you basically have today is Trump and people around Trump continuing what basically was a trend that's already been occurring in American society. How do we see this? Well, we see Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, saying things about the 1924 restrictions on immigration that barred Asians, Italians, Jews, Africans, Middle Easterners, and other Southern Eastern Europeans was basically a good idea. Grant would basically find pretty much that was a good idea too. On May 12, 2017, Representative Steve King from Iowa tweeted, "Culture and demographics are our destiny. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies." Of course, those somebody else's are the ones that we've heard about at this panel today that they're talking about. Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller, two of President Trump's top aides, have strong views on restricting immigration, both undocumented but actually legal immigration, to get back to the good old days of primarily European immigration. Both favor restricting all immigration to the United States except from Europe, and they want to have English requirements as a way of entering in the country in order to return us back to this golden age of a pre-1924 America. When Stephen Miller was asked about Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me, you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free," he said, "That poem was added later. It's really not part of the Statue of Liberty. No maudlin sentiment here about those oppressed people coming to the United States." Donald Trump, of course, began his campaign, as we've already heard, by calling Mexican immigrants murderers and rapists. He called into question Judge Gonzalo Curiel, because he was Mexican-American and therefore couldn't do his job because he was prejudiced against Trump, I guess because of Trump's many reasons. We're all prejudiced against Trump. But Donald Trump called the children of Mexican undocumented parents anchor babies. And he said he didn't believe that they were really U.S. citizens, even though they were born in the United States. And if you want more on that, you can read my new book. And basically, the internet and media echoed many of these same sentiments continuously during the campaign because we heard so much about them. I'm really talking about today about how I wanted to interact and engage with that rhetoric. And I asked myself, what does it mean to be the subject of this kind of pervasive discourse? And the question I asked was, do words hurt? Because we've always heard that sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Well, sort of my medical anthropology side comes out and says, is that true? Don't words really hurt as well? And I kind of got the idea because after reading The Souls of Black Folk, I signed it in my first year pro-sem in anthropology for grad students. He asked basically, how does it feel to be a problem? And that's exactly what I'm asking. How does it really feel to be a problem, to be the focus of this rhetoric? And Ronaldo Rosaldo in 1999 had a similar point when he said that basically Latinos have the mark of Cain because of our continual association with being foreign. And so I wanted to ask this question. I teamed up with a psychologist, Belinda Campos, at my campus, and I created a lab, and I did basically a psychological study to see what is the impact of rhetoric on the way people think about themselves, on their mental health. And we had 285 college students of Mexican heritage who I said were basically the target of most of this discourse. And we presented them with stimulus, basically, as psychologists do. Positive images and discourse on immigration and Latinos, and then negative immigration images about Latinos and discourse about Latinos, and then completely a group of given complete neutral images and discourse. And basically, then I wanted to see, well, do words really hurt? Does it really affect the mental health of people who read these things and are subject to these kinds of continual assaults on themselves? And I asked participants to view and read these images and discourse, and then write about that and tell me what you thought. Tell us what you thought about it, and then how you feel about that. And then we asked some standard measures in psychology about health, about well-being, about stress, about belonging, identity, community participation. I'm not going to give you the whole deal. I just want to give you some things out of it, because what it turns out is what people say about people, particularly when you hear it as public rhetoric, it really can hurt. It really affects people's mental health. Participants who received negative information frequently included in their responses that they wrote such words as sad, upset, angry, hurt, offended, and feel bad. I'm not going to go into this, but then we used some indexes that use very similar words to study their emotional and affective responses. But I just want to show you, people actually were drawn out with these words. People who were given completely neutral images, they didn't come up with any of these words. These words were drawn from them as they responded to these images and rhetoric. As one 24-year-old Mexican-American woman said, anger, rage, frustration, impotence are just some of the words that come to mind, but I have so much to say that I am not able to properly articulate what I'm trying to say, much less express myself in a healthy manner. These types of aggressions are not new to me, so I know what it's like to have these words and images being shouted at you, making you feel out of place, ashamed and inferior, even though you were born in the United States. We created a stress index out of standard psychological questions about stress. Each of the questions themselves are interesting, but just to let you know, a person's perception, the stress index measured a person's perception that demands or pressures exceed their ability to control things in their life and cope with problems. Exposure to the negative rhetoric and discourse that we gave to these students, these young people, statistically significantly raised their stress levels compared to those who viewed positive rhetoric. Words and images can hurt. But interestingly enough, on the positive side, those who viewed positive images and rhetoric, this can have a salubrious effect. It can actually make people feel better about themselves and about their sense of well-being. Those who experienced positive rhetoric often use such words in their responses as proud, happy, benefit, empowered, contribution, community. None of those other words. As a 19-year-old Mexican-American woman said, U.S.-born said, as a Mexican-American woman, I feel proud reading the quotes and seeing the images. I feel very emotional because in the present day, individuals discriminate not only against immigrants, but their children. I am glad to see that we are contributing to society, and I wish Americans could see that. I wish they can see we are not harming their country, in quotes. Obviously, by putting quotes around it, engaging in the discourse. We are helping it grow. Exposure to positive media rhetoric significantly reduced stress levels compared to those who viewed negative rhetoric. Saying good things about people can make them feel better. What happens when the person spreading this negative effect, this negative discourse, this anti-Latino rhetoric, gets elected President of the United States? Well, we started our data gathering before the election. No one thought he was going to be elected, so it turned out to be somewhat fortuitous. And we were able to compare then some of these issues, some of the responses we got from before the election and after the election. And it's really interesting. Stress indicators are significantly higher after the election, very compared to those of the people we interviewed before the election. Subjective health indexes that we administered were significantly lower after the election. People felt unhealthy. They actually felt their health was less good than those before the election. It actually affected their perception of their very actual physical health. Subjective well-being, that sense that your sense of self, your subjective well-being indexes were significantly lower after the election. And it makes sense. The very person who's spreading the anti and hateful rhetoric about you is not the person running this country. So it makes sense it would affect the way you feel about yourself. You actually feel sick in relationship to the kind of things that were happening. In conclusion, rhetoric that divides by targeting some as a threat may have short-term political gains. It might get you to be president of the United States. It might get you people to listen to your talk show. It might get you, all these little things that you may get. But in the long term, you're really creating a bad and unhealthy environment for people who are the targets of that rhetoric. It creates their sense of well-being can be, in a sense, much less than it was in a context where you didn't have this kind of hate speech. In the long term, it can be a source of disintegration of the very social fabric because people start to feel alienated because of the speech. But on the other hand, remember, positive rhetoric can have benefits. To counter hate, you need love. I mean, I hate to go back to the Beatles. But what we can do everyday life is to stand up to stigmatizing speech, to talk about the positive, to deny the negative, to counter the negative, to remind ourselves and remind everyone around us the contributions we're making, the kind of the songs we're creating, the kind of activism that's out there, the kind of way people are working hard. I mean, there's more good stuff out there than bad stuff, even though we hear the bad stuff said constantly. Why do we do that? Well, because it's the right thing to do, and ultimately, I think it's the Boasian thing to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leo. Our next speaker is Gina Pettis, and the title of her talk is From Sanctuary Cities to Sanctuary Campuses, Latino Activisms in Northeast Ohio.
So thank you very much. I liked your ending, Leo. There's a lot of good things out there to think about, and I think that this panel really highlights all of those really great and hopeful things that we can embrace and hold on to dearly. As all of our panelists have shown this morning, a lot has happened since November 8th last year, when many of us confronted the grim news of Donald Trump's election. From travel bans to the elimination of DACA and the devastation wrought by hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, as well as the appalling differential responses by the current administration to these tragedies, to punitive responses and threats to defund sanctuary cities, increased detention and deportation, and the brutal reminder of Puerto Rican second-class citizenship. In the midst of all of these events, Latino communities, like so many others, have been under assault. Yet in the face of persistent hostility and immeasurable loss, these very same communities have responded with creative resistance strategies, resilience, and steely determination and hope. In Ohio, where Latinos comprise a growing presence throughout the state, Latino activist responses draw on long and deep histories of organizing that are enabled by new instances of solidarity. Faith-based communities, for example, have vocally affirmed not only their commitment to defy contemporary nativist and anti-immigrant hostility, but they ground this resistance in past solidarity movements like the Central American solidarity movements of the 1980s, and in places like Northeast Ohio that were crucial nodes for the Underground Railroad in the 19th century. Activists are drawing on that history as well. As thousands of people across Northeast Ohio responded to the effects of Hurricane Maria, with clothing drives, monetary donations, and filling shipping containers to bring to Puerto Rico, as well as visits to the island, and the willingness to take in extended kin and friends into their households in cities like Lorain and Cleveland, the language of solidarity, refuge, and sanctuary is resonant, and it fills conversations and political organizing. So in my presentation today, I offer some snapshots into what these moments of solidarity and sanctuary and resilience look like in Latino Northeast Ohio. As a community that has a long history rooted in migrant labor circuits of Mexican and Mexican-American families in the early 20th centuries and post-war Puerto Rican migration to work in the expanding industrial sectors of the economy, and also as a community that is increasingly diverse as a result of ongoing migration from places like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, Latinos in Northeast Ohio have responded in complex and creative ways to this landscape of risk, uncertainty, and vulnerability. Efforts to protect those facing deportation and removal, new rhetorical strategies around the meanings of sanctuary, and organizing to support increasing numbers of Puerto Ricans who are relocating to Northeast Ohio in the wake of Hurricane Maria, connect Ohio Latinos to broad sets of networks through churches, community organizations, and college campuses. Just as earlier moments of exclusion and disaster gave rise to powerful moments of coalition building, contemporary efforts hint to new possibilities and the creative strategies communities employ to sustain and support each other in moments of vulnerability, state-sanctioned removal, and displacement and rebuilding. By focusing on contemporary Latino resistance grounded in their long histories contesting state power, this paper responds to the call by Jonathan Rosa and Yarimar Bonilla, as many of our papers do this morning, to unsettle anthropology by refusing to reproduce what they describe as, quote, revisionist narratives by seeking to recuperate an inclusive United States that never was, unquote, and to push our discipline's analytic frames to consider how Latino communities are actively imagining and making new hopeful worlds. So I begin with a quotation. Quote, sanctuary is one of the only active forms of resistance we now have, unquote, explains Ruben Castilla Herrera, a community organizer and activist in Columbus, Ohio. It's a Saturday morning, and a small group of us is gathered in a quiet meeting room in the Columbus Mennonite Church in the city's north side to meet Edith Espinal, who recently took sanctuary in the church. As a middle-aged mother of 3 who has lived in Columbus intermittently for the past 20 years, Edith has struggled to remain in Ohio with her family and decided to seek sanctuary after it became clear that she was in danger of being deported. After briefly entering into sanctuary in the Mennonite Church on September 5, 2017, the day Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the ending of DACA, Edith exited sanctuary temporarily and then re-entered again on October 2nd, where she has remained. While Edith is one of only a handful of people seeking sanctuary in Ohio, she's part of broader sanctuary practices and movements that have long histories in churches, faith-based organizations, and broader activism. Research on recent examples of sanctuary movements in the United States and internationally is quite vast, and while there is debate about the efficacy of sanctuary as a political strategy, there seem to be several important areas of consensus among those who study and work on sanctuary movements. First, as Linda Rabin has argued, quote, sanctuary has remained a morally and religiously based obligation that often takes place outside the law, unquote. Second, as many writers have noted, the current sanctuary movement has deep roots in Central American solidarity and sanctuary movements in the 1980s that were bound up with intersectional struggles beyond immigration that include LGBT liberation movements and anti-militarization and anti-imperialist organizing. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for today's presentation, today's sanctuary movement represents a form of what political scientist Amalia Pallares refers to as, quote, family activism, a complex political strategy by immigrant rights activists as they construct, reinforce, challenge, and redefine notions of family to challenge deportation and family separation. As Edith described her decision to seek sanctuary in the Columbus Mennonite Church, she consistently referred to her family, especially her 3 children, and how being able to remain near them compelled her decision. These sentiments were echoed in an interview she gave to the Columbus Dispatch when she explained how much her family needs her and how they rely on each other. And she stated, quote, "We very much need each other. I'm the one who guides this family and makes sure the kids are doing what they should be doing and that they're not getting into trouble," unquote. Like other undocumented mothers, Edith highlights her importance as a mother and her struggle to remain in Ohio, a familiar strategy whereby, as Pallares notes, quote, "mothers make claims of belonging that are based on or strengthened by their motherhood," unquote. The emphasis on preserving family unity, according to Pallares, recognizes the legal basis of family reunification in immigration policy and is mobilized by, quote, "community, political, and religious leaders," unquote, as part of an immigration activist and reformist efforts. For Pastor Joel, who is the pastor of the Columbus Mennonite Church, family faith and seeking refuge provide the spiritual and theological basis for providing sanctuary to Edith. According to the Columbus Mennonite Church website, seeking sanctuary from violence is foundational to the church's American origins. Not only is sanctuary central to how, quote, Mennonites tell their story, unquote, but it forms the moral and spiritual framework that compels them to respond in the present moment. Quote, "In light of this calling, we have welcomed Edith Espinal into sanctuary in our church building. Edith is a neighbor, Edith is a mother, Edith is a child of God who fled violence and sought refuge in our country many years ago and wishes to stay united with her family in this city that has become her home. We as a congregation have heard Edith's story. We've been inspired by her courage. We are compelled to offer our church building as a place of safety and support where she can stay united with her 3 children and her husband," unquote. According to Pastor Joel, both this history of being what he calls, quote unquote, a sanctuary people, and the congregation's experiences with the Central American Solidarity Movement of the 1980s provide fertile ground for inviting Edith into sanctuary. This experience with sanctuary is an important part of the congregation's history, and as part of their 55-year anniversary celebration, they spent some time reflecting on the importance of sanctuary and their involvement in the sanctuary movement in the 1980s. Edith's struggle to remain in this country emerged precisely at this time, at the time that the congregation was reflecting on what does it mean to be a sanctuary people and to be a Mennonite church and a Mennonite faith community. And it provided them an opening to contemplate connecting their past and their present spiritual commitments around supporting Edith. In August 2017, as Edith was considering going into sanctuary, community activists like Ruben Castilla Herrera reached out to various church leaders in the Columbus area, including Pastor Joel, who then brought the idea to the congregation. According to him, he expected that there might be reluctance and that people might respond saying that this is moving way too fast and that people would worry about legal questions and the fact that entering into this commitment could last for a very long time. The pastor explained that given that his congregation is largely white and upper middle class, money was not an issue, so extensive conversations that happened in the congregation involved the logistics of ensuring that there were proper facilities to house Edith and her family. And the focus also shifted to not just kind of being concerned with the legal questions, but with the best ways that they could accompany Edith and her family through house arrest and restricted movement for an indefinite future. Now that Edith has been in sanctuary for more than 2 months, Pastor Joel calmly observed that the process has been transformative. Quote, "Sanctuary has been a gift and has transformed us," unquote. Pastor Joel reiterated this experience of transformation several times. The bigger story of all of this, he explained, is how welcoming Edith is making them reflect on what it means to be a sanctuary people. He described how providing sanctuary has deep historical roots and how this experience provides them with an opportunity to reflect on the meaning for them as a spiritual community. And then Ruben Castilla Herrera noted, quote, this has been a beautiful process. Quote, "ICE and others don't want Edith in sanctuary because there is power in this kind of resistance." And Edith, who was also present that morning, then concurred in Spanish, quote, Según el abogado, santuario no es una buena opción. Quería que yo regresara a México y no le gustaba la idea del santuario. She notes, according to the lawyers, sanctuary wasn't a good idea. She was very much discouraged going into sanctuary. My lawyers wanted me to go back to Mexico, and they didn't like the idea that I wanted to choose to go into sanctuary instead. Ruben and Edith's insightful observation about the power of sanctuary as resistance speaks to the visibility of punitive responses to cities, states, and others who dare to defy the federal government's demand that local entities collaborate and support federal immigration enforcement. In addition to Attorney General Jeff Sessions' ongoing threats to punish sanctuary cities, elected officials in Ohio, for example, such as Treasurer Josh Mandel, publicly announced support for state legislation that would punish cities and individuals who stand with sanctuary cities by holding them criminally liable for crimes committed by undocumented immigrants. Such attacks have led some immigration activists to consider whether a new language of resistance is needed. After Mass one morning at Sacred Heart Chapel in Lorain, Ohio, which is about 2 hours north of Columbus, Don Jose shared with me and my family the work that he and his wife were doing, visiting local prisoners, and how important it is to have married couples and families involved in this kind of pastoral work. Having his wife present to talk with the wives of incarcerated husbands provide invaluable support, he explained. Quote, "In the work we're doing here and with immigration, I really think we need to think about this kind of we need to think about this as a kind of hospitality. Maybe we need to talk more about hospitality rather than sanctuary," he explained. Sanctuary, he worried, has become a loaded term. Indeed, discussions around rhetorical strategies informs the framework guiding much of the activist and community organizing work recently in Lorain. The city of Lorain is nearly 25% Latino and has long been defined by activism by Puerto Rican and Mexican residents who welcomed and organized in support of Cesar Chavez in the 1960s and 1970s, actively campaigned for the successful release of Puerto Rican political prisoner Oscar Lopez in 2016, and developed various cultural institutions and social agencies to support Latino residents in the city. Most recently, immigrant rights organizations, such as the Lorain, Ohio Immigrant Rights Association, have been actively involved in developing relationships with local law enforcement, city councils, churches and colleges and universities, and other civic organizations throughout Northeast Ohio to create networks of support to respond to increased immigration and enforcement that has made undocumented immigrants increasingly vulnerable. The rising number of highly visible deportations of longtime residents in Ohio, despite appeals by local leaders such as the new Cleveland Bishop Nelson Perez and local elected officials, as well as more frequent check-ins with ICE, are some of the reasons why notions of sanctuary and hospitality are valued organizing frameworks for Latinos in Lorain and Northeast Ohio more broadly. These notions of sanctuary and hospitality take on particular significance and meaning in Lorain today as service organizations, community leaders in schools, and hospitals help with the arrival of hundreds and thousands of Puerto Rican families leaving the island post-Hurricane Maria. According to Victor Leandri, executive director of El Centro de Servicios Sociales in Lorain, Ohio, the impact of Hurricane Maria's devastation is leading to a new Puerto Rican migration. Quote, "When I walk into the building at 9 in the morning, we already are seeing a migration," unquote. These sentiments are shared widely throughout Northeast Ohio as cities like Cleveland and Lorain prepare and organize to meet the needs of thousands of new Puerto Rican families. As Edgardo Melendez and Jennifer Hinojosa have noted, of the 10 largest Puerto Rican communities in the United States, Ohio ranks 8th and consequently is predicted to be a significant settlement community for people leaving the island in the years to come. While this new migration is preceded by several years of significant Puerto Rican outmigration as a result of Puerto Rico's debt crisis, which there is a concurrent panel right now talking about the impact of the debt crisis in Puerto Rico, the exodus post-Hurricane Maria could be unprecedented. Melendez and Hinojosa estimate, quote, "Puerto Rico will lose the same population in a span of a couple of years as Hurricane Maria as the island lost during a prior decade of economic stagnation." In Northeast Ohio, as elsewhere, in the diaspora, community leaders, as well as social service agencies, are involved in helping those newcomers resettle. As the seriousness and reality of how the long road to recovery continues to settle in, local leaders like Lorain Councilman Angela Arroyo have focused their efforts on ensuring there is adequate housing for newcomers, as well as providing clothing and helping to transition kids into local schools. This poses a particular burden for a community that already struggles economically with regional unemployment rates higher than the national average, and with Puerto Rican households in particular indexing poverty rates of 29% compared to 22.7% nationally. Despite the marginal economic status of large numbers of Puerto Rican families, Councilman Arroyo notes that they have been actively supported and provided hospitality for those who need housing and to get their children enrolled in public schools. What is desperately needed, however, is greater resources from local, state, and federal officials in the resettlement process for those who have left the island with few resources. Quote, "I fear that the next wave of people coming from Puerto Rico are those of even in greater need," unquote. Thus, while local leaders and community activists have noted the critical role communities play in meeting newcomers' need, they also recognize and are organizing to demand greater federal investment and resources that are in line with relief efforts in places like Houston. According to Councilman Arroyo, quote, "I went to Houston after the hurricane to help, and I saw people getting checks for rebuilding in fewer than 8 days. In Puerto Rico, they are past 50 days since the hurricane and only 24% of the island has power, and they are already talking about pulling FEMA out. Yet FEMA stayed in New Orleans and other places for years. Why is Puerto Rico getting the cold shoulder?" Unquote. In conclusion, as the year 2017 comes to a close, and it often feels as if each day brings even more troubling announcements that signal the increasingly hostile political and economic context in which Latino communities live, close attention to the ways local activists organize and resist can provide many of us with much needed hope. As Ramon Rivera Cervera reminds us, activists play a critical role in what he calls, quote, "the circulation of hope, an investment in a political optimism that is a precondition for mobilization." Latino activists in Ohio both draw on hopeful histories of past sanctuary and solidarity movements as they develop new rhetorics and strategies for their political organizing today. In their embrace of familiar strategies of sanctuary and their efforts to fashion new ones around the notion of hospitality, we see not only the circulation of hope, but also a resilience that can inspire new social movements. As Ruben Castilla Herrera observed in reflecting on the enduring value of the sanctuary movement and Latino activism more broadly, quote, "The movement never dies, it just changes." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina. I really love how the papers are resonating with one another. Our discussant is Miguel Diaz-Barriga.
Thank you, Pat. His repeated lying is astonishing, leading to energy spent on contesting alternative facts as well as the formation of new political communities and increased hate crimes. I want to pivot off Pat Zavea's statement, both in relation to lies and political communities, to engage how these papers locate activism and resistance in relation to a post-truth era. We live now in an era where facts seem to have no meaning. The lies are both big and small, from the size of inauguration crowds to claims of fake news and denials of climate change, to doubts about the citizenship of people of color and others. Does this mean that something has changed? All of these papers start with a cautionary note. Trump is not exceptional, citing Rosas and Bonilla's claim that the characterization of Trump's election as exceptional effectively delinks present-day racism from colonial histories and disavows settler colonialism and silences critiques of global coloniality. That's a lovely sentence. As Leo Chavez points out in his thought-provoking paper, negative media representations of Latinxes is as old as this country. Yet, as Chavez notes, there's been a clear transformation in media coverage of Latinxes and especially of migrants. In his research on magazine coverage of undocumented migrants, Dr. Chavez shows that negative coverage has dramatically increased since the 1970s. He notes, over the last 50 years, public discourse has shifted from a more balanced approach to immigration to one that is decidedly alarmist. Since 1970, affirmative messages on magazine covers have steadily decreased, and alarmist imagery has increased. This precipitous decline in positive coverage of immigration is one symptom, I would argue, of the slide into a post-truth era. That is, the veneer of truth-telling has been scraped off, and it's really hard for me to believe that in the 1970s there was more balance, and indeed we've slid into a much more unfriendly media climate in which various news organizations appear to be on a rampage against migrants and the Latinx community. Chavez's analysis of negative coverage and an effect on Latinx students is in its early stages, but a clear trend of racist portrayals and how they hurt has emerged. Chavez looks at student responses to negative media messages before and after the election, 2016, and finds that anxiety greatly increased after Trump's election. Chavez closes his paper by pointing out the social cost of having an administration that seeks to divide and relies on discourses of hate. He says, these costs come in the form of disintegration of the social fabric and a sense of disconnect from people deemed other. In turn, this disintegration can lead to unwillingness to work together to build and maintain strong, stable, and safe societies. When that happens, we all lose. And I would extend on Chavez's statement by saying that the current administration does not seem to care about the social fabric or working together to create a safe society. This politics of exclusion, I would argue, represents a transformation in sovereign practices, not only within the U.S., but I would also like us to think about this globally. At least that is what my own research on the global proliferation of border walls indicates. And as in the case of border walls, this politics of exclusion is aimed at creating both citizens and subjects who live in a state of anxiety, seeming powerlessness, and feeling that they do not belong. These sovereign practices rely on lies, or as Agamben would point out, the absence of logos or reason. That is, post-truth is not a coincidental element of these sovereign practices, but rather foundational. Dr. Bolivar's, Andrea Bolivar's elegantly written paper on transgender women also runs the issue of change in the face of continuities of violence and hatred towards transgender people of color. While agreeing that the activities of the new presidential administration are extensions of past practices of hatred, Dr. Bolivar notes that one must recognize the gravity of the current political system. And indeed, on the night of the elections, 8 people committed suicide, and calls to the Trans Life Hotline, based in Chicago, increased dramatically. Jacina, one of Dr. Bolivar's friends and interlocutors, had been drug-free for 10 years and even volunteered as an addiction counselor. However, after the election of Trump, she returns to drugs. Well, it's difficult in some ways to think of Trump in this regard in terms of business as usual, and I want to suggest that something indeed has changed. I'm sorry, that's a very powerful story. The hardening of hate has been countered with building alliances between documented and undocumented transgender migrants, as witnessed by another of Dr. Bolivar's interlocutors, Brenda, who travels to New Mexico to advise members of the Rainbow 17 group, a group of transgender migrants seeking asylum in the United States. These alliances between, and I'd like to introduce this category, citizens with diminished rights and undocumented or non-citizens, is a theme throughout these papers. And it's a theme that I want to draw out as my comments move on. For example, Dr. Gina Pettis' paper addresses alliances between Mexican, Central American, and Puerto Rican communities in Ohio, both in terms of protecting people from deportations through the sanctuary movement, but also providing sanctuary to Puerto Ricans displaced by the United States government after Hurricane Maria. These new rhetorical strategies around sanctuary hit at, as Perez notes, powerful moments of coalition building and creative strategies that communities employ to support and sustain each other in moments of vulnerability, state-sanctioned removal, and rebuilding. Here, as in the case of Bolivar's research, citizens with diminished rights, that is, Puerto Ricans displaced by the state, and non-citizens are forging new alliances through the concept of sanctuary. I was astounded to hear that sanctuary movement being extended to Puerto Ricans displaced by the hurricane. Alex Chavez, in a similar vein, shows how musicians and artists in Chicago, and more specifically in Pilsen, use sonic practices to generate coalitions against displacement and gentrification to show that they belong, or in his words, and I'll paraphrase here, that they are here and they have been here for a long time. Pat Savea's paper tracks two changes in reproductive rights activism after November 2016. First, more focused attempts on warding off the attacks of the current administration on reproductive rights, and second, greater attention and care to the plight of undocumented immigrants. She tracks these changes. The paper is really quite incredible, and my main and modest comment on this paper is just to pause for a moment, to wonder how it is that these groups at once are focusing, and even some are cutting staff, but at the same time they're intensifying their activism around issues related to undocumented immigrants. Those two don't necessarily go hand in hand. Dr. Zavea describes the impact of Trump's elections on citizens who are activists. I think this person's probably a citizen, as Pat Zavea describes as, and I love this description, one Latina known for being intimidating was now intimidated to speak publicly because of her accent. Another advocate affirmed racial tension has been so high since Trump came into office that most organizations have now intensified their work on the Latinx immigrant population. So this point is worth reflecting on further. And here, I think it's useful to consider another element of the current administration's politics of exclusion to highlight why we're seeing this coalition building between undocumented migrants and citizens with diminishing rights. Militarized borders. Trump's campaign success was based on both attacking people of Mexican descent and calling for a border wall with Mexico. While it is true that border militarization and wall construction predated the current administration, Trump has brought wall construction and anti-Latinx policies and rhetorics to the forefront of national identity and consciousness. This attack is both on the Latinx community as a whole and undocumented communities, takes place simultaneously through border wall construction. The wall affects both citizens and non-citizens alike. It increasingly excludes and cuts communities, as well as enmeshes border residents, the majority of whom are of Mexican descent, into a broader project of border militarization. The U.S. government, through the Department of Homeland Security, waived more than 35 laws in order to construct the border wall. And this is a little known, or not much discussed fact about the border wall. DHS was given the power to waive laws to build the wall. It waived over 35, and this is a classic state of exception where we sort of break the law to uphold the law. Border wall construction also enabled the transformation of the southern border into a zone of death and exclusion, a zone of what Margaret Dorsey and I called necro-citizenship, where death and militarization is normalized, with over 6,000 immigrants dying mainly from exposure and dehydration while attempting to cross into the United States. We're averaging about one immigrant death a day in desert and remote areas of the U.S. Southwest. The militarization of borders and the creation of death zones is not limited to the United States, but is global. Since 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, over 65 nations have constructed walls, and more are under construction. This reinforcement of borders has taken a heavy toll globally, with thousands of migrants and refugees dying in transit each year. Borders and border crossings do figure prominently in all of these papers, and as such, they reference broader sovereign practices based on exclusion and death. A key aspect of these sovereign practices, I would argue, is the diminishing of citizens' rights and the targeting of non-citizens, thus keying us to understand the collapsing of the categories citizens with diminishing rights and non-citizens. It's perhaps not surprising then that we find these new forms of alliance building. So to conclude, these papers engage a series of themes. First, the current administration as exception set against a recognition of the larger histories of colonialism and racism. Second, lies and attacks by the administration on citizens' rights, the Latinx community as a whole, and the undocumented. And third, the creation of alliances between citizens with diminished rights and non-citizens. I would add that borders and border crossings figure prominently in these papers, so it is useful, I think, to view them as interventions in a global politics of exclusion and death that creates, basically, subjects without rights. Indeed, in their explorations of the politics and meanings of Latinx dissent in a post-truth era, the papers on this panel both reference the turbulence around sovereign practices associated with exclusion, displacement, and death, and trace their circulation into everyday life. Now, more than ever, Latinx anthropology that we see, for example, in this panel, is needed both to document the particulars of how Latinxes are navigating the treacherous waters of the seas of lies of a post-truth era, and to advocate for alliances both across the various marginalized peoples and between citizens and non-citizens. It's only through such alliance building that we can steer our communities from the rocky shoals of state policies aimed at exclusion, death, and the diminution of rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. We have about 10 minutes, so if anyone has any question or comments, please use the microphone so we can all hear one another in this huge room. And while I wait for us to collect our thoughts, I want to invite the panelists to pose questions to one another or make comments about each other's work. I think there was just a lot of conversation going on here.
Hi, so I'm Jessica Hernandez. I'm from the University of California, Riverside. And I was, also, my apologies for coming in a little bit late, so I don't know if this has been discussed already. But I wanted to know where y'all saw sort of the actions that then Mexico's government has been taking in reference to Central Americans. And so I know that within the Latinx community, especially right now with like Coco coming out and all this excitement about representation in the media for Latinxes, there have also been a lot of questions around identity and who belongs and who's an immigrant in Mexico, and then sort of how that has been coming up in the Latinx communities, especially like in Southern California. So I was just wondering your thoughts.
Well, I'll respond to that. From what I'm hearing from, particularly one of the organizations that works in Southern California, is, as they do their community events and have conversations with people, they're really running up against the importance of reflecting on diversity within the Latinx community and the way in which Central Americans, youth, might be have qualitatively different experiences than Mexican immigrants, and that those experiences are related to where you settle. So in Los Angeles, that used to be Mexico, and you've got these generations of settlement, and then you've also got indigenous migrants. So I'm hearing a sort of a new discourse around we need to acknowledge all of these different experiences and highlight different voices, and I think that actually is qualitatively different.
Mm.
Hi, I'm Eve Villarreal, Our Lady of the Lake University. I've been, of course, concerned and also very interested about the attacks on sanctuary and sanctuary cities, because we've seen recently that ICE actually went out and attacked cities that have those policies and did roundups. And they posted, kind of very triumphantly, their attempts, and it was called Operation Safe City, as a matter of fact, in which about 500 people were rounded up in specifically places that have declared sanctuary or have these policies. And so I've also seen, because we have this reversal and defilement, right, of the concept of the moral center of that radical hospitality, right, that has a deep history, in the United States, a lot of people are wondering, well, maybe we shouldn't even say it, or maybe we shouldn't even use this term because it's been defiled at this moment, right? And I kind of see this as a secularization process in which the spiritual center of a concept that holds religion and politics in tension is being ripped from that concept in order to create regimes that kill, right, or regimes that further oppress or create diminished citizenship. And so I'm wondering about sanctuary, and the protection of refugees and the building of walls and how we can reclaim that concept and recover its moral compass instead of rejecting it and throwing it away. What can we do to make this the center of our movements in order to reclaim it for ourselves? And I think it kind of runs across all of the papers that you're talking about here. So just any comments you have?
I think you stated that really beautifully, Aimee, about how to, reclaim and make and preserve that as a center. And I think that is precisely the question, at least where I'm working in Northeast Ohio, among not just faith-based communities, but other community organizers to think about kind of what are the pros and cons of both preserving the language of sanctuary, but then trying to think about, is the language of hospitality another way to kind of circumvent the way that sanctuary has become this bad word. And to me, that's really baffling. Like, when did sanctuary and providing refuge to people who are vulnerable become a bad thing, And so, but I think that, I've been kind of paying attention, at least in Northeast Ohio, to what are some of the efforts at the local level to kind of educate and to bring people along to understanding this long history of sanctuary. And again, I think Northeast Ohio, we have a particular history of the Underground Railroad, especially in Oberlin, Ohio, where I live and work, that takes a lot of pride in kind of this very clear kind of defiance of different kinds of laws in the name of providing sanctuary and refuge, and that in the case of the 19th century to fleeing slaves. And so I see these different efforts at the local level. And so, for example, this upcoming week, the American Friends Service Committee is hosting a sanctuary for everyone and sanctuary everywhere, different kinds of talks around Northeast Ohio, trying to bring different community activists and people together, I think, as a way to kind of reclaim that as a moral and spiritual center. But I think that these are ongoing conversations, and that will be really interesting to see how it plays out. Something I'd love to talk with you more about later is what you raised about, is this a way to move away from kind of a language of spirituality? And I think you said around secularism, and I'm not sure if that's the case, but I'd be curious to learn more about what you think about that and others.
Yeah, if I can just briefly, so I think I invoke that language, right, with sanctifying the sort of space, right? I think it's sort of a call to what Gina's talking about, clearly a different context, right? But I think there's also this sort of critical ordinariness about those aspects that people sort of hold dear and how they operate in daily life. And it could be something as simple as a mural, right? Or what is home, right, in terms of a neighborhood and those sorts of things. And that's an idea, like I'm still working through that, how to use that concept in different ways, because people are, even if they're having sort of questions around it, it's defilement of how you put that. And it's something our friend and colleague, Todney Thomas, who's at the Divinity School at Harvard, and so just conversations with her, that she's also working around this issue of sort of public space and sanctifying within very similar contexts of sort of urban renewal, and for her in terms of Black vernacular geographies, right, where you have churches that are burned or businesses that are burned, right, to do what? To pave the way for developers, right? You see that happening in these neighborhoods too, right? All of a sudden there's like arson, right? And so in these really, in some ways, really important spaces for people, how does that, as a tool, like, and those spaces are important, right? And so how are people sort of animating this sort of expressive grammar in everyday life to try to hold on, right? And so I think sanctuary is very politicized. I was just trying to think about very similar practices, but including in a different context, I suppose, right? So, but yeah, that's great.
Just one quick note. I think we have to be really careful, because I think what Trump has been very successful at is making us question everything we hold of value. And in a sense, by dividing and conquering his strategy continually, making everything that we know has value seem like it doesn't have value. CNN doesn't talk about the truth. We should kill all reporters. We should, everybody who's a Mexican is a possible rapist and killer. I mean, we can't let him take away everything we think is of value. It's just not worthwhile. And hopefully this time she'll pass. I mean, we called Obama the deporter-in-chief, but here we have the destroyer-in-chief, because he's destroying families every day in large, incredible numbers. And let's talk about immorality. Let's talk about unleashing the dogs of war in the INS and ICE, and going into people's homes, picking up people with off the streets, tearing away mothers and fathers and kids from their family members who are U.S. citizens. It's just, I mean, it's unparalleled, the kind of destruction that's occurring right now. And the question whether or not sanctuary is a good thing or not, that's a moral issue. It's absurd, to tell you the truth, that's the level we're getting at. That when we have other issues that are so important, that everyday violence that's occurring in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, that's the issue, that's the morality, and that's the immorality that has to be focused on. To divert us into questioning our own morality continually, I think, is only gains in the favor. Now, I'm hoping another 2.5, 3 years this will be over, this nightmare that we're all living in. But in the meantime, I think we have to be very careful not to let ourselves continually second guess what we think is important and valuable. Thank you.
And thanks for referencing these larger politics of exclusion and death, which I think is not only happening in the U.S., but also to some extent globally, as we see with the militarization of borders and reinforcing of systems of global apartheid. Just want to point out that one way to support or move this issue forward, at least within our association, is to support a resolution that's being circulated against the proliferation of global border walls. And I think that would be a significant step for the American Anthropological Association.
Okay, I'll try and sneak in maybe one last question.
Yes.
So this is really encouraging. I want to thank all of the speakers for speaking about Latinx activism. A couple of things that came to mind, especially with the discussion of media discourse and what's happening there, is it reminded me of Otto Santana's wonderful book, Brown Tide Rising, from the late 90s, in which he discussed the dominant metaphors that are used in news media outlets to talk about immigration, immigrants, and the nation state. And I think some of the metaphors that he uncovered in that research, where he talked about immigration being framed as dangerous waters, the nation state being framed as a house that's subject to invasion, and immigrants being framed as prey, are some interesting things that it reminded me of that, but I'm also hearing a lot of new discourses coming out in the activist communities where talk is more about things like hospitality, with the house framed as a space of generosity and welcome, with discussions about inclusion and presence and immigrants, not being the perpetual newcomers, but having been here for ever. And I wonder if some of you could speak a little bit to perhaps maybe the language that you're seeing emerge as the new metaphors, the new discourses that unite some of these activist movements. And my question is rooted as well in my own research with activists in Western New York who are agitating for licenses for undocumented people, as well as pushing back against Polimigra, the cooperation between local police and immigration officials. So I'm thinking a lot about the discourses that are having to be created in order to make a public argument for those policy changes. And I would love to hear about discourses that are really helpful in the activist communities you work with.
So I'll go very quickly. One of the things I'm hearing from the Movement for Reproductive Justice is less use of metaphors and more sort of a strident kind of language. So I hear a lot of unapologetic and unafraid, sort of borrowing from the immigrant rights movement. So I think you're seeing sort of an amping up of the confrontation around this discourse.
I think, Otto's book's really good. 2002, I think it was, UC University of Texas Press. Mine's 2001, Covering Immigration, which also examines a number of metaphors that in the public discourse. If you want to take a look at that, I think it'd be pretty useful. I think what we're seeing, and I kind of gave some examples here, is there's some new metaphors, but I think some of the old metaphors are being dusted off and brought out because they never left us. The metaphor of reproduction, the metaphor of the demographic change, the changing face of America, the idea that there was going back to a better time, which is really about demographics. And I think the reproduction and demographics and the browning of America are just basically these metaphors really haven't died out. And in fact, they're motivating a lot of people under the Trump administration to look for a way to get us back to a previous face of America. And so I think those metaphors are still very, very relevant. Water metaphors are still very important. The floods, the tides, the borders, and in various ways borders are represented in visually and discursively are still there. I'm trying to think what new metaphors have come up because really there's so many existing ones that they can use. I'm not sure, but reproduction is still incredibly important because it just signifies so much about the changing face of America.
You have time for one more? Or
Sure, they haven't kicked us out yet, so.
sure. Are you familiar with the Only English movement, by any chance?
The what movement?
Basically, a hostile movement against people speaking Spanish.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. So in the context of anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Latinx, I want to know if you have experiences or from your research how Trump discourse, the xenophobic anti-immigrant discourse have created like hostile environment or bad experiences for Spanish speakers in your communities.
Well, I mean, he's done it in a lot of ways. He said that America's an English-speaking country, and yet, I live in a state called California, near Santa Ana, south of Los Angeles, north of San Diego, and of course, Rodeo Drive has been anglicized, I guess, right? Even though, so he's, Spanish has been here a very long time, but there's a lot of Native American languages that somehow he seemed to forgot that are part of the American tradition. Yeah, it's a very narrow view of what America is, and it goes back all the way back to Madison Grant and others, where people thought that English was somehow, the only way you could be American. And I think since the beginning of this country, there's been a lot of languages besides English.
Unfortunately, we're over time, so I'm going to thank you for coming. And Miguel has copies of the resolution about the border walls, if you would like to pick up a copy. Thank you very much.